Right, everyone, we are starting again for our next panel. But before we start, I want to announce that we have a winner for the AR game. Liz Kravchenko, where are you? Is she around? They are outside. They left? Oh, okay. So they kind of gave me this, and I will give Evelyn the prize, so you can give them later. Yeah. Me. Okay, so now I'm calling Reagan Glover from the University of Michigan, who's going to moderate the next panel.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here and hosting this event. This is really exciting to be here. I'm here to introduce Eric Gordon, our next speaker. Eric Gordon is a professor of the practice of journalism studies and the director of the Center on Media Innovation for Social Impact at Boston University. His research focuses on technology and public engagement with a special focus on the role of narrative, data, and algorithms on institutional trust and governance. He specializes in collaborative research and design processes and has served as an expert advisor for local and national governments as well as NGOs around the world, designing responsive processes that help organizations transform to meet their stated values. In this talk, Eric is going to talk about embracing inefficiency. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to him, and I look forward to an excellent talk.
Thank you. We didn't order an excellent talk, so let me, I'll have to work on that one. All right, it's great to be here. Thank you, Adriana, for inviting me to speak, and it's just a pleasure to listen to everything that's gone on today. And I'm hoping I can add a little bit of perspective, especially coming off of the last keynote. And I have two computers up here. My notes are over here, and my slides are over here, so I might fumble a little bit. But just to give you some background. So now I'm at Boston University, but for 2 decades prior, I was at Emerson College down the road where I directed the engagement lab, and some of the work that I'm going to talk about comes from that part of my career. So for most of my career, I've studied technology and democratic participation. I've asked, how does democracy and its systems of governance align or not with the socio-technical systems built to support it? So I'm also a designer of participation tools. At the Engagement Lab, I've built dozens of apps and civic games with partners around the world, thinking that the building these tools and building these games was the intervention that I was engaged in. I invested in civic games, serious games, engagement games, not because I'm a games scholar per se, but because I'm interested in what games do, as we just heard Lindsay talk about. They can create more human, usable interfaces between people and institutions, and thinking with and through games has been my driver, my motivator. So before even arriving at my interest in game systems, I cut my teeth in this civic tech world in the early 2000s. These were heady times. There was a lot of enthusiasm about technology and its promise of streamlining the institutions of democracy. And even before Zuckerberg, the ethos of move fast and break things was inspiring government bureaucrats everywhere. This way of thinking nudged a new generation of bureaucrats to become frustrated with government operations. So as the internet took hold and young entrepreneurs were eager to reform government and civil society organizations were slow to change. Local governments continued to rely on blunt instrumentation like town hall meetings and phone calls for decision-making. People would gather, city officials would talk at them, record their voices, and claim to listen. De Tocqueville made the New England town hall synonymous with the concept of American democracy, but outside of a few ideal town halls in New England, in practice, it was mostly theater. By the early 21st century, community would gather and mostly represent the abstract concept of participation with very little impact on decision-making. At the same time, as Amazon and the rest of the early commercial internet came to demonstrate more precise ways for the public to provide feedback to a range of institutions, public expectations began to change. So local governments understood this. Starting around 2008, the civic tech movement, then open government and open data, were all pushing towards more usable systems. Organizations like Code for America, which was founded in 2011, and city innovation offices like New Urban Mechanics right here in Boston were pushing the narratives of streamlined, efficient government services. In this picture, these are my friends, Chris Osgood and Nigel Jacob, the co-chairs of the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics here, posing for a publicity photo representing a new day for city government. I think I might have been in the background as this photo was taken. We were also enthusiastic about digital innovation represented by these smartphones and what we might be able to do. So from the city perspective, innovation was a competitive marketplace. With a little help from IBM, then later Google and 1,000 other tech vendors, cities started dreaming of the smart city. Smart meant interoperable, smart meant efficient. Smart was a direct counterpoint to the dumb town hall. A binary was hardening between smart and dumb. Other sorts of democratic values like care, inclusion, agency, to the extent they existed before, were getting squeezed. So even though I was in the thick of this stuff, I was also a critical voice. With my friends at city halls around the world and a growing movement of critical data and smart city folks like Anthony Townsend and Chris Ledontic in this room, I added to the chorus of critiques of the techno-solutionist thinking that was driving government reform. My critique went something like this. Government institutions tasked with governing are responsible for more than just smooth transactions. They are responsible for making decisions that represent all their constituents, especially those who have historically been denied access. And yet, the technologists who are driving government reform are focused more on what technologies could do than what government should do. They're going after the low-hanging fruit, and they are building 1,001 apps for more efficient transactions. It was clear then, just like it's clear now, that not everyone was a beneficiary of that approach. This is important. Government needs to deliver services efficiently and reliably. But in order for people to use those services, they need to trust government first. And the research is crystal clear that trust in institutions is in rapid decline around the world, especially within Western democratic nations. So the app approach to governance works great if government is trying to reach the publics that already trust them. But for those who have been historically ignored or actively excluded, building an app that streamlines existing workflows will only dig deeper trenches. But efficient transactions build trust, right? Well, not necessarily. People develop trust in public institutions differently than they do in brands. Delivering a good product reliably is why one might trust Apple, but providing services and protections for oneself and one's family is how one cultivates trust in government. The latter is much more relational than the former. Apple doesn't need to know anything about the customer except their buying habits. Government needs to know, or at least be sensitive to, people's complex identities and needs. And finally, and most importantly, people need to trust government with that sensitivity. Civic tech, smart cities, open government, even open data, we're racing towards transactional efficiency with little room or even tolerance for the humanness of institutional public life. Ironically, in order to solve the problem of inhumane bureaucracies, we in the civic tech world, with all of our great intentions, we're laying the groundwork for inhumane technocracies, applying neoliberal Silicon Valley concepts to public problems. In some way, we teed up Elon Musk and his so-called Department of Government Efficiency to reduce all government functionality to transactions. In this dystopian vision of government, no different than government.com or amazon.gov, it delivers services to paying customers as cheaply and reliably as possible. but its role as a facilitator of democratic decision-making, a defender of human rights, and the distributor of services that support everyone's lives and livelihoods is gone from this picture entirely. Now, I understand that these are unrealistic ideals, but when government institutions give up on claiming them even as aspirational, the battle lines change. Musk has said that his goal is to hack the source code of government, to reprogram it. I'm afraid that we, the well-intentioned civic tech champions of the past, have contributed to the TXT file of that code. So as a designer and a scholar, this has always been uneasy for me. In 2020, I wrote a book called that critiqued the conflation between customers and citizens and made the case that public serving institutions should not adopt tech primarily for efficiency. The result of this transactional approach to public life, I argued, has been a reduction, not an enhancement of trust. I coined the term meaningful inefficiencies, and I argued for us to use tech to deliberately design inefficiencies into systems as a means of building relational trust, to make our government systems more, not less human. So this concept was inspired by games. As I mentioned, for over a decade, I've been designing civic games or game systems that facilitate democratic processes. What I have found most powerful about games is that they are, as the philosopher Bernard Suits claims, necessarily inefficient systems. So famously, he uses the example of golf, and he says the fastest way to get the little ball into the little hole is to pick it up, walk over to the hole, and drop it in. But of course, the game puts unnecessary obstacles, as he calls it, in the way. Long, skinny sticks, sand traps, water, wind, etc., in order for us to play the game. The goal of any game, Suits says, is to play the game. And I think the last talk we just heard really exemplifies the difference between structured games and structured play. And this is really about what Suits was saying, again, is that the goal of the game is to play. We enter into the system in order for us to operate in that way. Playing within the system allows for players to solve problems, often connect with others, fail safely, and repeat towards mastery. These all sound like great qualities of any system, and yet we are living in a moment where they are being squeezed out. All systems, according to Musk, should move people from point A to point B in the fastest way possible. That is no way to create sustainable systems of governance. All of our public systems, from voting to public participation to public problem solving, should be meaningfully inefficient, appropriately and intentionally incorporating play to provoke relation, creativity, and belonging. Without this, we give in to being part of the machine. We cave to the innate value of technology, and we don't allow technology to evolve with us towards more human and humane systems. This is different from systems that are merely inefficient, as I've called them, which is when systems don't work and create feelings of frustration, alienation, and resentment instead. I'm afraid that DOGE, in its aspiration towards efficiency, has actually produced merely inefficient systems. The idea of meaningful inefficiencies was beginning to get some traction. COVID jolted governments to rethink values and to consider user experience as part of government's role of facilitating just outcomes. I started working with governments around the world to consider how they were using data, for example, and how to build processes to gain more input into the development of algorithms. And then Trump took office again, DOGE took over US digital services, and overnight, in the popular imagination, efficiency muscled out every other value in government reform. And technology, particularly AI, was the clear tool to achieve it. This is a real picture, by the way. The concept of efficiency has been weaponized against a vision of government that is human-centric and relational. The ability for people within public serving organizations to act without fear is compromised. So here I am, 5 years after publishing that book, promoting meaningful inefficiencies as a tool for government reform. I don't believe that anymore. It is no longer a nudge for liberal government reform. It is a means of resistance. We don't have to design games or even call what we do game design, but we need to design play into our systems so that we can subtly and strategically rewrite the source code of government. My new book called Generative Listening is picking up where I left off. On the level of source code, I ask how institutions can collect, analyze, and communicate with data such that they can effectively listen to constituents. Especially in the wake of clear government surveillance with AI, my hope is that we develop mechanisms of institutional listening so that governments and other public serving organizations can understand and be responsive to community needs instead of only controlling and manipulating them. Thanks very much.
Okay, so now I'm going to invite our panelists up here. That would be Celia Paris, Amy Sherwong Liu, and Eileen McGivney. And each of these speakers will present roughly 5 minutes, followed by a good Q&A. So start thinking what your questions are. We want a really engaged audience for this. Yes. Give a 5-minute introduction. Just do your thing. Okay.
Can you hear me? Is this working? Okay. Hi. Welcome. It's really great to see everyone here. I'm super excited to be part of the Center for Transformative Media. Great talk, Eric. Really nice. And Lindsay, that was an outstanding keynote. Really, really inspiring and very dense, full of rich nutrition. There's something I've been thinking about for a long time, which I wrote about in my new book, Play Frames. Some of you were at the opening event for that in February. And I'm going to just rant on it a little bit now. So I'm wondering if game design is design at all. And the reason this has been plaguing me is because when I was working on the book, I was reading a few things. And granted, some of the more scholarly designers here will probably go, no, you're wrong. But I was reading particularly Psychology of Everyday Things and some of these other kind of canonical popular design documents. And one of the things that kept coming up was efficiency, reducing friction, how important it is to reduce friction in design. And I was thinking about it and I thought, well, that's not what I do. My job is to add friction. My job is to make things harder on purpose. And importantly, I have to make things harder on purpose in a fun way. And arguably, that is much harder to do than making things efficient and low friction. So this is just a question I don't know the answer to, but it's one that's been really nagging at me for a while, which is like, is it really design if what we're trying to do is deliberately make things harder? And I think Lindsay did a really nice job of describing kind of how we can do that in a designerly way, right? Using that chick sent me high kind of sweet spot between frustration and boredom. And I don't know if I have much more to say about it, except that I just think it's something to think about that. And I loved your talk, Eric, that like maybe friction isn't such a bad thing if it's well designed. And I think especially in learning, like in my classes, I try to make my classes as gamey as possible and create kind of deliberate things that are challenging in a fun way for the students to do, which is one of the reasons I consider my classes AI proof, because people actually want to do the assignments. So, and partially because they are hard, but they're hard in a fun way. So I think that's all I got for now. So I'll pass it on to the next person.
Hi. Okay, guess it's working. So this is Amy. I'm jointly appointed between KMD and Bouvet. And I'm primarily actually do health video game research with a focus on intervention of using stories and different kind of design techniques like customization, tailoring to improve people's health outcome. So during my dissertation phase, I tried to study customization of how to study blogs to persuade people to exercise. And I found that when the bloggers actually show similarities with the readers, their reaction to the blog improved, their intention to exercise improved. And I continue this line of research by actually doing more about, how do we create characters that will appeal to people with my NIH-funded projects. And I found that sometimes when we create characters that look like the people, for example, for our child obesity prevention project, we create this kind of overweight obese characters to appeal actually more to overweight obese children. And instead of, thinking negatively about them, they like to exercise more when compared to being exposed to those kind of superhero, super muscular looking characters. So it seems that with all of this design literature, psychological theories, behavior theories, it's pointing to something like tailoring, creating things that look like people, make people feel comfortable, give people what they want, would work. But just over the years, increasingly, I'm starting to also asking this kind of question from an empirical perspective. That is to say, is there like a level of tailoring that is healthy versus creepy, invasive, and a little bit scary? Because later, when we studied how children actually, in one of the projects, view the narrative characters, we actually created some of the characters that look like the underrepresented population, exact like, you see some Black characters in there, versus some of the characters that are actually a blend of all kinds of like race, ethnic groups in there. So everyone sees a little bit of themselves, but it doesn't look entirely like them. And to our surprise, most of our participants who are underrepresented children groups really like this kind of like blending of not entire tailoring condition. So that started making me wonder. And also, given the current, a lot of the news websites and a lot of like, even Google, a lot of this internet conglomerates would give us a lot of options to tailor what we want to get or to customize what we're going to receive. And is that actually giving everyone what they want, going to create something better for everyone? Or is that going to actually create a certain kind of echo chamber and to delete this kind of potential difference that people might grow out of that? So I guess my question here is, to what extent should we tailor? And of course, I'm not here trying to villainize tailor of underrepresented groups. I think that is justice, and that should be really promoted. I guess what I'm trying to ask here is, to what extent is the mirror of this technology reflecting us versus trapping us in there? And to what extent can we actually grow? To what extent can we actually develop interest in things that are different from our opinions and our perspectives? And all of this, seems to be more or less related to what extent are we willing or should be exposed to something different. So I'll just stop here.
Hi, excuse me. I'm Eileen McGivney. I'm an assistant professor in CAMD. And before I came to academia, I worked in education policy research. I worked at think tanks and thinking a lot about how do we reform and innovate in education at scale across government systems, and looking at the role innovation and technology could play. And over time, once I came to grad school and started thinking about, what research I wanted to do long term, I got really interested in virtual reality. And that's what I've been working on for, the last, 7 or 8 years. And when I was asked to present a provocative idea for this panel today, I thought of, the idea that people ask me all the time, okay, well, you're working on virtual reality for education, but how can that scale, or, developing individual products or applications or something? How are we ever going to see this at scale, or how do we get virtual reality to scale across our education system? So my provocative idea is that we should not scale. We shouldn't be worried about scale, and we shouldn't think about scale. I think it goes against a lot of what the corporate side of the tech industry is going for. Meta just announced their Meta for Education program, which is going to make it easier to manage devices in a classroom. It's something that I have firsthand struggles with in lots of different contexts. So I see where these efforts are coming from. They're well-intentioned. I talk to a lot of VR creators who want to get into the education space, and they think about, well, we need to just make it plug and play. We need to make it one click. So a teacher can one click and everybody has their headsets and they're controlling everything. So the reason why I'm saying that we shouldn't go that model is it actually really mirrors what we've done with education technology for generations, which is we focus on the devices, we focus on getting them into schools at scale. So let's purchase a Chromebook for every kid. Let's put a smartboard in every classroom. And what we end up with is, a social system of the classroom that just absorbs this technology to do the same things they were doing before. So your tablet becomes a worksheet, your smartboard becomes a blackboard. With virtual reality, I can see a really clear vision of that, right? Which is, well, instead of watching the video, I put you in the headset so you'll focus better on the video. And I've already seen that happen in some schools and classrooms. The alternative approach, I think, is if we don't focus on scale and we focus on building capacity for students and teachers to build very small scale, very niche applications that suit their own needs, what we get is a whole generation of people who actually knows how the technology works. What we get is new systems that don't rely on Meta to manage all your devices and therefore collect data as a way to make money off of you. What we might end up with is actually lots of really interesting new approaches to how these technologies can support education and learning. And I don't think that this is a really far-fetched idea because right now, there's tons of new tools. People get hung up on, well, virtual reality is very expensive to create. So even if you have the headsets, but we're actually finding lots of new entrants in the market who are making it really easy to create new tools, to use AI in creative ways, also to create new environments. And then I also think if you give a bunch of kids headsets and some creation tools, they'll figure out how to jailbreak things. They'll figure out how to create really interesting things too. So that's my provocative idea.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to each of you for presenting such provocative ideas. I want to now turn to questions from the audience. Does anyone immediately have a burning question? And I'll bring the microphone to you for accessibility. We have one over here.
Hi there. Thank you for all of your experiences. And the question that I had was that I noticed that there was a photo that you had put up that was of a golf course. And it seems like when it comes to play, there's like three major systems. There is the player who interacts in an environment, such as the player or golfer will compete against the golf course. There are skill-based, such as darts, where you are trying to demonstrate your skill in using a mechanic. And then there are games in which you are playing against another player, such as basketball, baseball, in terms of those team elements. The effort for a player to express themselves seems to be like an internal drive to learn about the world around them. But there's also external influences also influencing players. So for example, in the early 2000s, I think it was like 2008, America's Army was produced by the American military in order to recruit people. So do you see the influences of play having in this kind of tug of war between external and internal influences being on the larger side of players wanting to express themselves or external influences wanting to influence themselves onto players? This is especially important in Massachusetts because sports gambling is a big factor. And as people become more and more accessible to different types of play, there's going to be other external influences. So where do you see it in terms of this kind of like tug of war between internal and external influences?
Yeah, I would like to start with a couple of things. And this also kind of relates back to what Eileen was saying. One of the most popular, actually two of the most popular games right now are Minecraft and Roblox, both of which are very low resolution, not high tech, not VR, no AI, but kids can build their own games in them, and they're incredibly successful. And I feel like that's the kind of classroom environment that Eileen's talking about, is that the friction is a constructionist learning type of friction where you're making things and that's how you're learning about technology. And that's really important because I think that the status quo of the tech bro culture, which we now find ourselves literally being governed by, is opacity works in favor of power structures. The less we know about how to use technology, the more powerful those people can be. And so the more we can let people under the hood, understanding how the underlying technology works, even if it's not fancy and high end. My niece plays Roblox every day. She doesn't care that it's just chunky, funky graphics that look like games I played in the 80s. But she has a great time. So I think that's really important because we place, especially the game industry has placed so much impact on high-end graphics. And it turns out that that's not the killer app. The killer app is creativity. And so I think to me, that's a really important starting point when you're talking about expression, right? That giving people the opportunity to express themselves with technology is a really good way for them to learn about it. So that's my starting point in response to your question.
I just want to add this perspective of user agency, that I feel that if you want to define games of all different kinds, be it created under whatever influence of what agency out there, we should not ignore the perspective of the players, that a lot of the times they mod, recreate, and sometimes can subversive the original purpose of the games. And I just leave it here.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, I mean, you're talking about games. Some games are highly structured, and I mean, like competitive sports, for example, are highly structured games. There's not a whole lot of room, in some cases, depending on the level of competition, for play. I mean, and when it happens, it's a kind of extraordinary, you know, that things sort of move beyond what one expects. Again, depending on the level of play. I want to kind of remove us a little bit from talking about games. I mean, I know all my colleagues here are talking about games, and that's so. I mean, within the education space, like these well-crafted games in order to enable this play, I think is so important. But I want to expand our idea even beyond games. And what I'm suggesting is that, you know, school is a structured set of rules, right? Government is a structured set of rules that we are in these systems. Society is filled with a bunch of systems with all sorts of external kind of meanings and pressures that are put on the people within them. And I think what play offers us is a way of resisting the motivation of those systems merely to go as fast as they can towards their functional or their instrumentality, right? And in some cases, instrumentality matters when we need to get people, when people need food, when people need sort of the basics of life, housing. But in some cases, we actually need to identify places where we can move beyond that instrumentality, especially at a time when technology is just solidifying all of those structures and motivating expediency above all other values. And so that's what I mean by, like, I think we can, all these examples of sort of play in classrooms and play for learning, it works because what we're doing is we're opening up opportunities for exploration, for safety, for freedom of failure, all the things that we've talked about. And we need to be thinking creatively about how that can actually exist within our culture, even outside of something that we can identify as a game. So I think your question is exactly right. We need to understand the sort of external versus internal motivation, whether we're talking about something we can call a game or something that, or just systems that we live in within our public and even private lives.
More questions? Who would like to ask? I think I see a hand back here. Okay.
Hi, it's a question more related to Eric that just came up, and I guess it's a question of questioning the face value of the use of the term efficiency as a sort of mask for all sorts of other motives or all sorts of other logics to be applied. Because at the end, the end game doesn't seem necessarily to be efficiency. The end game seems to be something else, or I guess it depends on what you call efficiency. So I guess it's a bigger question of how do we reconcile what seems to be like very different uses potentially of this term relative to socio-technical systems that heavily weigh on people's lives and their, capacity to live.
Wow. So I'm trying to understand how to answer that question, because your how do we reconcile the definitions is really what you're saying. And by we, you mean just
The public.
the public. Like how can we make sense of when the term efficiency is used to justify the functioning of the system?
Yeah, in ways that aren't necessarily about efficiency, but are about chaos.
Totally. And this is what I was saying, that this is what I try to communicate in my talk, that I think that ultimately the value of the Department of Government Efficiency is a mere inefficiency, right? It's the same as when it's like the same as the spinning beach ball on your computer, or the line at the DMV. It's the bottom side of flow, right? It's when, or the top, I can't remember, but it's when we have anxiety and frustration, right? It's that is being imposed upon with efficiency. And what I want us to think about is, I want us to think about unpacking that ideological frame. So that we need to understand that when the technology claims to make a system more efficient, not only do we have to unpack what the technology is doing, but the system in which that technology is imposed upon, right? So technologies are hardening our systems. And if we agree that the value of a system is efficiency, then of course the technology is just going to supercharge that. And so, but if we start questioning what the value of the underlying system is, then we can create new technologies that do something different. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. I think it's a good one.
I think it's the question of like when efficiency and inefficiency become code for other things. And so in some ways, like reinforcing the use of the term as it is being framed reinforces the legitimacy of its use.
Yeah. Can I chime in here? Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you're saying, is that like the rhetorics of efficiency is really what you're talking about. And I also want to I think it's pretty clear that the rhetorics of efficiency that we're talking about with Doge is capitalistic rhetorics of production efficiency. That somehow the idea that we can have better government if we just do it cheaper with less labor, like we're building a Model T Ford. You know what I mean? It's not efficiency. It's not a generic kind of efficiency. It's a capitalistic construct of what efficiency is. And I think it also goes back to kind of this capitalist, the sort of Protestant work ethic and the capitalistic priority of that also has been put in opposition to play, which I think Lindsay very eloquently stated are not opposed. In fact, often playing is work. And one of the things I talk about in Play Frames is that professional athletes are paid to play. Their job is to play games. Kids who play video games are used to working really hard to solve puzzles or to solve some of the problems that Lindsay was talking about. At the same time, you have these grindy kind of factory capitalist game mechanics, which a lot of free-to-play games have, which is, just very kind of grindy, right? Which is where the boredom thing happens. So I think thinking about where these terms are situated culturally and what they're trying to achieve is really important. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah, anyone else?
Only that it just brought up a thought for me too, which is like that sometimes I think, and the way Celia put it makes a lot of sense. It's like efficiency is couched within our capitalist system, right? So we value efficiency kind of inherently within that system. But I think we have to think about the trade-offs. And maybe that's one of the pieces you're asking about is like, what's the trade-off of prioritizing efficiency? What do you lose? In the case of education, we lose out on what I would say is meaningful learning experiences, right? It's very easy in a classroom to teach certain things efficiently, but not the types of things that a lot of people learn from play, which has more to do with working hard, solving problems, and achieving things more that are more, situated in our actual practices too. So I think it's interesting also to think about, you have to admit that there are trade-offs too. And in a lot of environments, we prioritize efficiency over a lot of other things.
Yeah, and I think in this context, efficiency is a code word for less humans, less people working. So laying people off is a sort of the fast go-to for, okay, we're going to be efficient. We're just going to get rid of all the people. And a great example of where efficiency has failed colossally is in AI art. I mean, I've been doing all these experiments with AI, and my favorite is I generated some swing dancers and the female partner had 3 legs. Humans can easily tell, a 3-year-old child can tell that this is wrong, but for some reason these fancy computers, which are making art more efficient, cannot figure out that humans have 5 fingers and 2 legs.
I just want to give one more example to Meryl's prompt, which is, it made me think of, I've been working in the kind of public engagement space for a long time and facilitating public engagement processes. And I remember having conversations with, government officials, sort of justifying the need for public discussion. And the best argument that I was able to, the one that was convincing to them, was that it actually the conflict early on will make the process more efficient, because then people won't be upset a month down the line if you engage them early. And they bought it, like that was the argument that worked. And what was and I felt so dirty, like having to use that argument, but that was the one that worked, was for me to say, yeah, this is actually going to make it efficient, even though I knew that what I was doing was creating opportunities for play and meaning making and all those things that I believed in, but I had to frame it in such a way that was compelling to the customer, essentially, in this case, which was the government agency.
If you don't mind if I have like a follow-up response or thought to that is also, if you can maybe also talk about the duality of the evils and the goods in each of these contexts. I was just thinking about Roblox, and I'm somebody who studies kids and their uses of media in all forms in games. And it's Roblox is also built on essentially child labor, where, and in some ways that are kind of gross. And also it brings them joy at the same time. And the reconciling of that, it's not removing morality from the situation, but it's also just thinking about the complex soup that is human morals. And I guess, reconciling or not reconciling, I guess, at all, that duality.
I think another thing that connects back to something Lindsay was talking about was the importance of failure. And a lot of research into gamer culture, especially gamers in the workplace, shows that people who play a lot of video games are better at failing. And this is something I'm teaching my first-year students this year because they're very worried about showing things that they think are not finished or are not any good. And I keep telling them the whole point of this class is to learn to fail often, fail well, and learn from your failure. And this is a place where I think games really, and this inefficiency, right? You cannot learn if you don't fail. And so that's another way that inefficiency, I think, is actually really a positive thing.
Just want to add a little bit from the health intervention perspective. I guess the efficiency can be defined from very different ways that you can look at the specific cost ratio benefit for intervention versus individual experience versus the metrics. So I guess what I don't want to offer here is a potential one-size-fits-all definition for that, but more just like Celia mentioned during the gameplay, sometimes we need to experience some of the failures to be able to reach the end as part of the growth. And the growth success should not be dependent on this kind of super smooth transition from one stage to another, but instead we need to be offered some kind of maybe optimal or more personalized kind of balance between the both. But I don't have a specific magic bullet solution to this. I think it really depends on a lot of people's perspective and a lot of people's collaboration of different opinions.
everyone's perspective in this panel got me thinking, so I want to pitch an idea and then see how you guys respond to it. This idea that perhaps play and game designers are friction engineers, and that low friction moves fast, but mastery requires management of friction. So it's like moving down a luge in a sled or trying to careen a car across a track, and that inefficiency or friction isn't actually a hindrance, but it's a way to manage and control, to sort of govern direction, to avoid careening into a wall or to read the braille.
Yes, yes. I come from a family of kind of car nerds, and I'm sure that my dad's worst nightmare is a driverless car.
I just want to riff on that idea and bring up something that you said about you didn't call it this, but it feels like it's a tension between scale and reproducibility, right? So. And in some ways, within the tech space, like reproducibility is deeply inefficient mechanism because it requires a kind of understanding of the local, the specificity of implementation, all of those things, right? And you can then potentially come up with a mechanism to reproduce it in different locations, but you can't just assume that it's going to be one thing that scales. And so, just sort of riffing off of what you're saying, I do think that there's that technology, like AI, for example, does give me some hope in that there's some optimistic use of the technology that allows us to think about reproducibility in a way that we haven't been able to before, because we can actually accommodate the local and reproduce it at scale, as opposed to thinking about scale and the sort of monochromatic consequences of that. And so I think, and so I wonder if we, so yes, that's inefficient in some ways, and we're adding resistance, friction. We're adding some friction, but we're also potentially we can sort of wield the technology in such a way that allows us to sort of achieve our goals. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't mean we have to compromise on what our aspirations are, right? We don't have to think small just because we're starting small. We can actually think big, and the technology may allow us to think at that scale.
Yeah, so I think part of the reason I brought up Roblox and Minecraft is because they are at a massive scale. I mean, I think Roblox has like over 1 billion players now. And part of my work in studying online communities over the last 20 odd years has been focused on creativity, and that the killer app is creativity to me, that when people can make stuff, they get excited and engaged, and it's very sticky. Like, you may not be aware of this, but Second Life is still running strong. And many of the people in it have been there for over 20 years. I mean, I started in 2003, and I'm still there. I still go there almost every day. And why? Because people can make things and share them with other people, and they don't have to be fancy. They can be simple things, right? But those kind of communities where people have the ability to create their own content and share. I mean, look at YouTube as a great example of this, right? People are willing to work at making this content if they can share it with the community. The downside of this is the emergent behavior that has resulted in so much misinformation and conspiracy theories and all this other kind of stuff is built on the same scalable infrastructure as something like Minecraft. So one of the things I think we need to think about is not only working at scale, but also understanding how to manage and mitigate bad things that happen at scale, which is something that we've really not been good at. So I don't know what the solution to that is, but I think it's something that needs some attention.
Guess my only extra addition is that I hope there will be some kind of personalized oversight about this interaction process between us and the system. Yes, AI can help us to scale up a lot of things, but I hope there will be some kind of human factor there supervising to make sure that this process is not as automatic and dehumanizing.
Yeah, I think that's the key. That's what I was thinking about when you were talking about reproducibility is kind of the key piece of that. I don't know, in the education policy world, we would talk about spread instead of scale, right? So an idea can spread, but a program scales. So the idea that we could build systems that are very, flexible and adaptive and customizable, but make them easy to kind of, customize. But I think that the key piece in there is keeping the purpose of it is to more engage the human in the process. So rather than just automating something that everyone should use across, every classroom in a school, you give the teacher the time and space to adapt it for their own classroom and their needs, the way they do with all their education materials. And that also builds in some of the, then you ensure that it's not exploitative or, nefarious.
This is a question I have just from a few attempts I've made to work with schools. A couple of things I've noticed is one of the things is that most teachers are too overworked to want to learn anything new. And nobody cares about anything that isn't going to improve test scores. So this is a challenge. And I was just talking to some people at an event I was in Sweden about this, that the one time I was very successful, actually the two times were I had a game that happened to fit into the exact curriculum at this precise moment that they were studying this thing. And the teacher was ecstatic because we basically did all the work for her. On the other hand, I worked with a faculty at a local high school here, and I wanted to get some grants to do things. And they were like, we don't have any time to work on grants. And so figuring out how to empower the teachers, I think, is super important. Because they're the ones who are dealing with the scale. Even me, I probably taught maybe at this point thousands of students how to design games. And so I feel like we need to figure out how to make that scale happen at the teacher level first.
Yeah, I think a lot of the ed tech industry thinks about students as the end users, but teachers are, and that's often why you find a lot of programs are better suited towards informal education, right? Where they go direct to students and they don't have to worry about systems of schools. But I think just to add, I don't have any answer to your question, but one thing to think about is people focus a lot on school resources at schools to do programs to implement new technology to improve things. And I think they focus on money as the resource, but anyone who has spent time in schools knows that time is the biggest scarce resource. So teachers, more than anything, need to be given time. And then on top of that, we need different ways to reward our schools that don't have to do with answering math tests.
A couple months ago, I was in a relatively small town in Central California, and I was invited to come to a computer club that kids go to after the classes are over. And the person who runs it isn't a super high-tech, she doesn't really have a high-tech background, but she has found all these cool tools. And it made me wonder, what are teachers already doing on their own? And could we potentially do some work there and see what's easiest for them to use already, and then build off of that instead of trying to cram all this new technology down their throats?
That when we were working with a lot of children serving institutions in Dorchester, when we were running the projects a couple of years back, we did notice that actually a lot of the schools, after school programs, and also children serving institutions were actually, when they're short on funds, we're not trying to embrace the latest technology about gaming, but instead they're all falling to a lot of old consoles. Not as old as next door, but a couple of years old, sometimes 10-year-old, and they're still functioning with TVs that's not as fancy as a contemporary version, but they all work. And children really like it, and they manage to actually source this out to a lot of community donors and also parent groups. And as a result, it worked for children to actually provide them with a very enriched after-school life, educating them about the media and technology and what's available for them. So I just really think, just like VR, XR these days, why do we always have to chase the most up to, date thing?
I love this because a few years ago, when we used to run Indiecade and Culver City, we had this really weird thing where the Disney animation department was about to decommission a bunch of slightly outdated, and by slightly I mean like 3-year-old computer graphics machines. And so we borrowed them for the festival, and then we gave them to the Culver City Public Schools. And for them, it was like this amazingly high-tech thing, but for Disney, it was literally garbage. So that's a really smart strategy, is finding old tech that's old, but that's still new enough to be useful in that context.
Do we have additional questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, I've been really enjoying this discussion, and I come from a design background. So when you mentioned the design of everyday things, that's a book that is pretty common reading for all of us. An essential theme that you touched upon is like minimalism. That's always been very popular right now, ever since Bauhaus. That's kind of like the messaging that we're given, is design it to be really minimalist, really simple. And so that kind of goes against the meaningless, I forget the inefficiency term someone said.
I think it's meaningful inefficiency.
Yeah, meaningful inefficiency. And so I thought that was really helpful to frame things of like, it doesn't have to be super efficient to be useful. And then the whole talk about efficiency made me think of like the Jevons paradox of, even though something can be really efficient, like the more efficient something can be, it can also lead to more demand. And then there's just this cycle of like, you're never out of this efficiency trap. And so I guess my question is, as someone who's in the designer and civic tech space, I know there's a lot of interest and momentum in that area right now. So, but there isn't always a focus on like using tech. I think there's like a focus on glorifying tech. So I guess my question is there an opportunity for civic designers and civic technologists or anyone in that space to be more meaningful in their work? And I guess how can we work with the public sector? Yeah, how can we like apply all this knowledge, I guess is my question.
I'll take the first stab at that. Thanks for the question, and thanks for your passion for applying these kinds of skills and perspectives to civic tech, because it's desperately needed now. I mean, I think I probably have a different answer for this than I would have had a month ago or 2 months ago. I don't know what month it is anymore, but like, we're kind of in a different world, and we don't exactly know how this is going to play out. I will say over the last 15 or so 20 years, as like within the public sector, these innovation offices were riding high for years, and they've had all sorts of different. They've had all sorts of the different faces. Some of them existed within tech or IT, and in some cases, a CIO, which was the chief innovation officer, was just basically replaced by the chief information officer, just became the chief innovation officer. So it was just the thinking at first when these things were scaling was just like, this is all tech, this is all tech. We're just gonna build more tech in government. And this is kind of what I was saying during my talk. It's that it was just this build that I was a part of, which was just like, we're going to bolster these offices within governments because we need to add more of this, a different kind of thinking to government operations. And what ended up happening is that recently, I mean, even in the last like 4 or 5 years, a lot of these innovation offices closed. They've been closing, or they've been folding into quality improvement offices, things like that. And so we were sort of riding high for a while, and then the wave crashed. And now there seems like there's a kind of interesting move towards civic design, or these kind of interesting roles within the public sector that I've seen that are not necessarily in innovation offices, but they're sort of couched within other agencies. And the reason why I'm saying that I'm not sure how things are now is that, I mean, a lot of these agencies, or a lot of these distributed agencies, what used to be the innovation office that are now sort of like moved off into other units within government, they're going to lose their funding, right? So I don't know how this is going to play out. But I will say that I feel like I was saying, I feel like there's more need for this now than ever. There's more need for people who want to be thinking creatively and humanistically about the tech to actually move into the public sector in meaningful ways, or at least to operate alongside the public sector, even if there are no public sector jobs. So it feels to me urgent to figure out how to do that. And I'm not saying this to sound super fatalistic. Like, I actually think that there's opportunities here, but we just don't know what they're going to look like in the coming years. Some of those are going to exist within. I mean, universities hopefully will pick up some of the slack, and some of this will sort of exist again in partnership with the public sector. But I just wanted to add, like, sort of bounce off of that question, and to say that you probably got from my talk and some of the conversation that we're having is that I actually care about institutions, and there is this tension sometimes when we talk about creativity and sort of grassroots creativity in particular, that sometimes we seem to be bypassing the institutional frames in order to make robust kind of grassroots creativity happen. And I've always been kind of invested in kind of thinking about the institution and how those things can be integrated into institutions. And as I've said, I've done a lot of reflecting recently, and I think what I used to think of as a reform project has become a little bit more radical, in that I think that this really is, just as is being done on the kind of national and international level, a recoding of institutions. I think we need to be thinking about recoding institutions with all of these values that we're talking about, but I really hope that we don't ignore them. You know, like, it's not the time to say the institutions are broken, we're going to do something else. Like, yes, we have to make new institutions, but ultimately public schools and government organizations and even legacy media, they still matter, you know, and so I think we can start, if we can think creatively about how to work alongside those institutions, we can do something more than reform. We can actually sort of birth new institutions within them. And so I just want to sort of advocate for not turning our back on them and investing in, you know, people like you looking to the public sector still, like, what can I do there, as opposed to what can I do outside?
I wanted to say something a little broader, which is that, so I've been working in games since the 20th century. I love this. One of the comedians says, I'm from the 1900s. Anyway, I'm from the 1900s. And one of the things that drives me absolutely out of my mind is that technology creators think they're the first to do everything, and they never are. I did my first VR game in 1993. And most people have no idea that VR existed in 1993. And I think it's really, really important, especially for people that are in a scholarly context, to do your homework and find out what happened before. Because otherwise, instead of reinventing the wheel over and over, if you study what was done before, you can invent the car. So I just want to say this to everyone here, because we are in this like weird techno fetishist, everything's new, and it's not new. None of it is new. What's new is it's cheaper, it's more scalable, but it's been around for 60 years. So I think it behooves us as teachers, as scholars, as researchers, and I'm really excited about this mobile technology history exhibition that Adriana put on. The minute she told me about it, I'm like, yes, we need more stuff like this. We need to tell these stories, because we just keep trying to do the same thing over and over again without really understanding what happened before. So I just wanted to say that that's one of my regular rants.
Just want to add really quickly here that I feel like to make a big impact, we need critical mass. And that doesn't have to be a consensus, but I'd like to see some constant discussion, debate, and exploration in terms of the development of certain kind of metrics or the way to evaluate, to justify all of this impact out there. And I just hope whatever the debate would be, the focus is, as this panel has talked about, not just on the so-called efficiency on the superficial terms, like surface meaning, but instead a meaningful human experience out there.
final thing amplifying that, which is that we talked about in the earlier session today, public impact, and institutions need to value public impact more, especially universities. So I sort of behoove everyone here who's in an institution to teach the people up the food chain that public impact is as, if not more important than the 3 people reading your peer-reviewed paper. Thank you.
I believe that we have time for maybe one more question, maybe 2 if we push it. I know there was a question over here. Oh, okay, over here.
Hey, well, thanks so much for all these great perspectives. And I really appreciate, to the point Eric was just saying, the need for kind of looking from the institutional level. I think this generally characterizes the perspectives we're hearing about kind of engaging stakeholders at the level of some sort of top-down change, right? But I think I'd be interested to draw out another term that might characterize, if we were to look at how these same values can be applied from a bottom-up perspective, right, of the sort of what a political disposition built around producing inefficiencies or friction engineering, as well as the material examples of jailbreaking, like Eileen mentioned, or creative subversion, right, that these might fall under an umbrella of sabotage. And I wonder if there's a way or how you all in your work might think about reconciling or dealing with the, kind of meta frictions of embracing sabotorial disposition while still, maintaining these productive relationships with people empowered to make top-down change, if those are 2 things that are at odds or can be reconciled.
A sort of a euphemism would be to say intervention, right? So I think a lot of us, probably everyone on the stage and probably half the people in this room have been engaged in interventions in various kinds of systems. But I think that that's a really valid approach, is to come in at some level. I mean, I'm not going to say the initials that we're not allowed to say anymore, but you can still do that without using those initials.
I just wanted to share, I was thinking when Lindsay was presenting and talked about, play as resistance, I thought that was a really interesting, kind of framing. And then also with, your talk, it started my gears turning, and I had been talking to Amy, sharing about how last night I was at a training for, people who are US citizens to help verify whether ICE is present in a neighborhood. So this is part of, I live in a heavily immigrant city, and we're trying to protect our neighbors. And so it gave me a good frame of, because when we were role playing, basically the tactic is that I have to be a Karen, right? I'm just part of the neighborhood watch, and there's a vehicle here, and we just want to know who you are. And so kind of like role playing from that frame. And when you're talking about sabotage, when we're talking about resistance, there's all these ways to think about different things that we might do in these times that do have kind of a playful edge, right? Like, oh, I'm going to put on a new persona. I'm the opposite of like a Karen. I would never call the cops on my neighbors. But if I pretend that that's my role, I can actually, help my neighbors in that way too. So I think there's kind of fun ways to think about these very unfun things that we might do too.
More pragmatic example that when my group was working on narrative development of existing active video games, the first one we picked was from Nintendo, who notoriously refused to work with any academic researchers and forbid us for putting their devices or any images related to their characters on any kind of promotional recruitment materials or even the mention of the name. But nevertheless, I think I managed to pull it through because I was making 2 perspectives to them. One is that we are not trying to cast a negative light on their exercise video game, which is going to be helpful to a lot of children without a lot of exercise. And number 2, I was running a government-funded project, and I'm not making profit from that. So I think that caused a lot of, I would say, potential evaluations of to what extent our contribution would balance between the benefit to society and also the benefit to ourselves. And it requires some of the evaluation and also how to situate ourselves in this kind of like chain of like demands. And then at that level, I think the sort of public intellectual self needs to stand out more and then try to actually find out the best balance to actually move forward.
I'll just add that.
I wanted to just also draw everyone's attention to the 4 o'clock session, which is actually including people on our own faculty who do this kind of intervention art, where they introduce a complex idea, kind of gamify it and introduce it into a public environment as an art piece. And I think this is it's kind of the sort of techno generation of the situationists, right? Where we're entering into a public context and introducing some kind of friction or thought exercise that I think is a very productive and potentially high impact way of reaching people with these kinds of questions.
And I'll just add that I'm not sure that saboteur is the right frame, only because if you think about it, democracy should be messy. That should involve resistance. And to go back to the games analogy, right? That Bernard Suits, who I've quoted several times today, one of the distinctions that he makes is he makes a distinction between a cheater and a spoil sport, right? And he says a spoil sport basically rejects the rules of the game and says, I'm not going to play. And the game's over. The game's over when you do that. But a cheater actually understands the game rules quite well and is able to manipulate them. And, you know, I'm afraid that we have to admit that democracy is all about cheating, right? And that really what we need to embrace is the messiness of the system, but to embrace the idea that the logic of the system is such that there's resistance and pushback. And when we are told that it's not, when we're told when we have to stage these interventions and you have to become the Karen, that's the problem with democracy. That's not being a saboteur. That's operating as it should, right? And not that you're doing this, but that it's. So I'm taking issue with that frame, and I think instead we should. So let's not be the spoil sport. And I don't think cheater is the right word either, although that's happening a lot. But I think what we should do is, in fact, actually, I think that what's happening in our national politics is a bunch of spoil sporting and not cheating, perhaps, But I think, you know, if we embrace that messiness, if we embrace the fact that if there is no resistance, or if one feels that any act of resistance is a rejection of the game, then the game is fundamentally broken, and we need to figure out how to make that game better.
Okay, I have a question for you. Do you think there's a form of ethical cheating?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, there's a form of ethical. I mean, I've seen Les Miserables. You know, I understand that sometimes you need to steal a loaf of bread. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's what you're talking about. I mean, sometimes the rules are unjust, right? So that's ethical cheating to me is when the rules are unjust.
So we are running a little on time. We have about 3 minutes left. And so I wanted to offer for each of you to say one final thought, maybe a 30-second takeaway for the audience based on the conversations that we've had. Okay. We'll start with Eric. Hot seat.
I feel like I had my mic drop moment when I said we need to become a nation of cheaters, but I guess I don't want to end there. Yeah, I mean, I've appreciated this conversation. I think that there is value in, and what I really appreciated about this is that, you know, us making connections between education and learning and democracy, I think is really useful. And I think that there's lots of learning across these fields that we need to really lean into, and that, you know, that ultimately, you know, if we really are serious about making more functional, equitable institutions that we feel like we can play within, that we have the ability to play within, that to me is what our goal should be. That's our sort of my end state is institutions that allow us to play, to be as human as we need to be.
I love that. I think, yeah, what I'm taking away from this that I hope others do too is a broader vision of play, what play can be, what it can do for us. And then also, I'm definitely mulling on this thought about institutions and also how like institutions are just people. So if we play more in institutions, institutions will become more playful too. So
I guess my takeaway would be in the future, when we are looking at a certain kind of play-related product, I guess we should be more critically and reflecting about the implication of that, to think about to what extent do they reflect ourselves and to what extent do they move us or change us. And in a more efficient or unhealthy or in a more provocative yet development kind of way. So I guess it's just like we need to think more deeply about play and also about the technological affordances we are going to be increasingly offered in the next decade.
I want to give a little bit of a callback to my opening remarks and also the questions having to do with the Donald Norman concept of design. And in, I think it's the psychology of everyday things, there's only one play artifact that he talks about, and that play artifact is Lego. And he describes building a motorcycle with a Lego kit and how amazingly intuitive it is. But at no time does he say that this is a toy or that it was designed for children. And so I feel like the sort of, and it speaks back to my discussion about Roblox and Minecraft, is that the kind of, can we Legoify civic engagement? Can we give people a way to creatively build, give them the building blocks in a way to creatively build the future they want? Even if those building blocks are very rudimentary, giving people the freedom and the agency to create the future they want, I think is more important than giving them the high-end technology we think can save everybody or somehow be more efficient. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the speakers. I just want to